Welcome to the 2021 and 2022 University of New Hampshire Saul O. Sador Memorial Lecture Series, Aging in America, Justice for All? My name is Laura Davey, co-director of the UNH Center on Aging and Community Living, and honored to be a member of the group hosting this year's series. This series was established in 1965 in memory of Saul O. Sador, a humanitarian and businessman. In addition to his Manchester-based mills, Sador was the owner of the Manchester Free Press, a member of New Hampshire's Advisory Committee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights, active in Manchester's Jewish community, and a driving force in support of the ideas of humanity and brotherhood throughout New Hampshire. My colleagues and I are grateful to be this year's hosts and are excited to launch our first session this afternoon, Aging in America. We are all in this together. Oh, went too fast. So we have a few technical slides to go through. Today's session is being taped and will be posted for future viewing on the UNH Sador Series webpage. Closed caption are available to all participants, and please look for this closed caption icon on your screen. After selecting closed caption, pick Show Subtitle, and the captions will appear at the bottom of your screen. By choosing View Full Transcript, a running transcript of the captions will appear on the side. You can also adjust the caption size by selecting Subtitle Settings. The chat feature is enabled for our webinar today. We invite you to post comments and engage with other participants using this feature. During the keynote presentation, you're welcome to place questions in the chat box at any time. We have saved time to entertain questions and discussion points after the presentation. I will now take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we all call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous people and their cultures and contributions. At this time, I invite Paul Poyo Sagmo, the Chief Speaker, and Denise Poyo Sagmoskawa, Head Female Speaker of the Kawasuk Band of the Pennacook and Abenaki people, to share the UNH Land, Water, and Life Acknowledgement.
Nandakina, away, away. Holy Joe, I'm gone, away. All you need, get in a wasp. All you need, get in a wasp. Nandakina, away, away. Holy Joe, I'm gone, away. All you need, get in a wasp. All you need, get in a wasp.
Kwai Nidobak, in Delawasin, Denise Pulio, Sagamasqua, Wood Delawasin, Paul Pulio, Sagamo, Kawasuk Band of the Pennacook Abenaki people, Neona Aian Odana Kuanipi. Hello, friends. My name is Denise Pulio. I'm the head female speaker, and this is Paul Pulio, head male speaker and chief of the Kawasuk Band of the Pennacook Abenaki people. We are speaking from our headquarters located near the ancient Pennacook village of Odana-Kuanipi, meaning village at the narrowing of the waters, on Lake Winnipesaukee, which is now known as Alton, New Hampshire. To start today's festivities, we sang a traditional Abenaki song honoring the land. We sang Indaki Na, which translates to our homelands, thanks to all our relations, thanks to the great mystery of life, the Creator. As we all journey on the trail of life, we wish to acknowledge the spiritual and physical connection the Pennacook, Abenaki, and Wabanaki peoples have maintained to Indaki Na, our homeland, and the Aki, land, Nibi, water, Olakwikiak, flora, and Awaasak, fauna, which the University of New Hampshire community is honored to steward today. We also acknowledge the hardships they continue to endure after the loss of unceded homelands and champion the university's responsibility to foster relationships and opportunities that strengthen the well-being of the Indigenous people who carry forward the traditions of their ancestors. Kitsil, thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul, and Denise, thank you very much. Aging in America, We Are All in This Together is the first of our 6-part UNH Sador lecture series. Between now and April of 2022, we will hold sessions covering the topics seen on your screen here. Caregiving, honor and burden, contributions and impact is our next one coming up in November. In early 2022, we will have Aging in Place, Black Perspectives, followed by Engineering for Humanity, Design, Accessibility, and Intergenerational Partnerships. We will also have Building a World that Includes Disability, and our last session is LGBTQIA+, the social injustice of being forced back in the closet. Information on each session are currently available on our UNH Sador website. And as registration opens for each, we will provide more details and the registration link on the website via email and other marketing platforms. Please take a note of the faces and names on this slide. They are each phenomenal champions for advancing our collective understanding of the dividends of aging. You will hear from each of us over the course of the series. Throughout the series, Kate Creary will be providing unique artwork for each session. Each artwork will flow into the next session, creating a final large-scale immersive mural capturing the spirit and intention of the series. I will now pass the mic over to my colleague, Jennifer Rabelais. She is also the co-director of the UNH Center on Aging and Community Living, to introduce today's keynote speaker.
Thank you, Laura. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Margaret Frankhauser, who will set the context of aging in the United States and the role we all can play in shaping our own future and the future of those we love as we all age. Margaret is the Director of Aging Services at John Snow Incorporated. She comes to us with over 40 years experience at the intersection of public health and aging, and she consults on issues of public health, healthcare system design, and aging. Margaret is an adult geriatric nurse practitioner by background. She served as a clinician and community health administrator in the National Health Service Corps, and later in rural and state-sponsored public health settings. Margaret previously served as the program chief of community epidemiology in the state of New Hampshire, where she oversaw a statewide team responding to communicable diseases of public health importance. For 20 years, Margaret served as CEO of a highly successful New Hampshire community health organization that offered home-based clinical and supportive services to both children and adults in rural communities. Also, for the first 15 months of the COVID-19 pandemic, Margaret worked closely with the New Hampshire COVID Operations Center to lead the response to COVID-19 outbreaks in congregate settings, including nursing homes, retirement communities, healthcare settings, schools, camps, and childcare settings. Margaret has a master's degree in primary care nursing from the University of Maryland and a master's degree in public health from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. We are proud to have her as our keynote speaker for this year's lecture series. Margaret, welcome. I'm so pleased that you're here with us this afternoon.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. That was a wonderful welcome. And I am just delighted to be here and be part of this series. I think this fits beautifully with the concept of the Sidor series because it's critically important for everyone in New Hampshire, frankly, everyone around the world, to think about aging and what it means for our society. And we'll talk about that more as we go forward through this session. But once again, it's just an honor to be here and talk about one of my favorite subjects, and that is aging in America. I'm delighted to launch this series. So we're going to talk about a number of things today. We'll discuss the general demographics of aging in the United States and the world. And we'll explore the concept of aging from both a biologic and a sociologic perspective, because those impact how we see and behave around issues of aging. We'll discuss the way most Americans and frankly, most people in Western culture view aging. And we'll consider the impact of that view on both people and our country. We'll review some of the challenges and the opportunities in aging. And we'll discuss how we all benefit when we view and treat aging in a different light. And then, of course, we'll listen to your thoughts about aging, because those are important in our dialogue. So I'd like to start off with a question. And the question is this, and I'd like you to chat in your responses. When you hear the term senior citizen, what's the first word or the first image that comes to your mind? And be honest, I don't care what it is, take a moment to chat it in, and I'll be watching the chat. Excellent, excellent. Keep chatting them in, because we're going to come back to many of those. And the reason that I asked that question will become a little more clear as we go through the presentation. So why would we talk about aging at all? Why is it an important thing? And the answer is simply this: the US population is living longer. So more of us will live to be over the age of 60, 65, 70, 75. And this, by the way, is not a one-time event. You often hear discussion about aging in America, and you hear, oh, it's those baby boomers. They're the ones doing it. And there's this implication that once the baby boomers are gone, there will be a settling out in the United States, and we'll go back to the way we used to be. And I want you to look at this slide for a minute. This is a famous slide pulled together by the US Census Bureau, used by the Centers for Disease Control. And even if you cannot see the detail in it, what it's really showing you is on the left, that thing that looks like a narrow pyramid is population age cuts by 5 years in the year 1960. The bottom slice of that is birth to 4 years of age, then 5 to 9, and in 5 years going up to the top. And what you'll see at the very top is 85 years and older. And as you look at that, when you look at 70 to 75, 75 to 79, very, very few people in that. Whereas at the bottom, it's really broad, meaning there are a lot of people in that period. Well, of course, what you're seeing at the bottom is the baby boom generation. Those first 4 cuts are the baby boom generation, the children who were born after World War II, after soldiers returned. And there was great incentive, frankly, pressure from the United States for families to have lots of children, and children they had. So that created the baby boom. Now, frankly, I was born in that time frame, and I would be in that bottom cut. I'm 65 years right now, and I was in that really big slice, born, 0 to 4 years of age in 1960. Now, shift your eyes to that right side. Now what you're looking at is the same thing, but projected forward to the year 2060 based on actual census information. And what you notice is that it no longer is extremely narrow in those older age groups. In fact, it's pretty broad in those older age groups. But if you look at the bottom, Now there's a swelling in the middle, but there aren't so many children. So what that means is, instead of the year 1960, when you looked outside the window and you saw a bunch of kids running around and very few older adults, now in 2060, you're going to be able to see a population that's really pretty evenly distributed in 5-year increments. And you won't see that huge number of children. You'll see people distributed throughout all age groups. So if you are 20 years old today, in roughly 40 years, you're going to be in that older age group. You're going to be at the top of that pillar. And it's changed from pyramid to pillar, and it's done it throughout the entire United States. So we are indeed a changing society. Let's see if I can advance my slide here. See if that will move forward for me. There we go. So what created those trends? Well, this is kind of a life slide on the left, but these are storks delivering babies. And the first slide that you're looking at is really 1906, 127 births per 1,000 women of childbearing age. And childbearing age is determined to be between the ages of 15 and 45. So in any given year, 127 children were born to every 1,000 women of childbearing age. Now, over time, that begins to decrease so that you see by the year 2012, that's less than half of what it was in 1906. Only 63 births to women in that same childbearing age. And frankly, if we look at the US birth rate in 2020, you probably heard about this, it dropped even further. I believe it was the lowest birth cohort in the history of the United States. 55.8 children born to every 1,000 women in that birth cohort. So fewer children is one of the reasons. And then there were advances in public health and private health so that people lived longer, advances in clean water, clean air, medications, antibiotics, and importantly, in this age, vaccines are the things that allowed us to live past age 10 and reach adulthood. And then once we reached adulthood, we extended those years so that we can expect now in the United States, and we'll talk about the impact COVID has had, we can expect in general to live into our mid to late 1970s. So we are no longer a population where we expect children to die after the 1 and 2 to die after the age of 10. We expect to live a long time. So where are we aging in the United States? Well, we're aging everywhere, to be honest with you. But there are differences among states based on who lives in those states. And you probably already know this. It's often discussed in Northern New England. Northern New England represents the oldest age cohort in the United States. If you do the cuts by median age meaning, of course, that half the population is above that age, half the population is below it. It's sort of the midpoint. The oldest state is Maine, and Maine has been the oldest state for a number of years. When this particular slide was made, New Hampshire was the second oldest, then Vermont and West Virginia. Sometimes New Hampshire and Vermont jiggle around for that, the honor of being number 2 and number 3. But the point about this is that Northern New England and Pennsylvania and Florida and the other states on the slide are the oldest states in the country, but frankly, as an entire nation, we're getting older. And that means that a higher percentage of our population in every state is going to be above age 60, above age 65. And that has implications for a number of things, for our economic policy. It has implications for housing, and we'll talk about them. But I want you to know the US is not alone in this. We aren't even the leaders in this. Japan are the leaders in this. You might already know about this. If you look at this map, which I'm afraid cuts off part of the world, I'm sorry about that, but takes in a good part of the world map, and you look at the red sections, you look at the oldest countries in the world. So Canada is slightly older than the United States, not older than Northern New England, but if you use the United States as a whole, Canada beats us. And Western Europe, with the exception of France. So the Europeans and Japanese and Canadians are right there with us. But beyond them, even in the developing nations of the world, people are living longer lives. And that's generally something to celebrate, that we don't die in the middle of our working years, that we live long and productive lives, and that is happening every place. So something to celebrate, but now a question for you, and I'm not going to ask you to chat this in, but I just want you to look outside your window right now and ask yourself, who do you see, if you see anybody? And of course, this is the Sador series at UNH. So I'm talking to many of you who are probably adjacent or somewhere near the campus. What you see might look a little bit like the picture on the left, with lots of young people in that frame. And when you see lots of young people, your thinking leads you to believe that that's the way the world looks, because that's the way your world looks. But last night, I happened to live in the Lakes region of New Hampshire, and last night I went to a meeting in one of the Lakes region towns. And these are not the people I was in the meeting with. This is a slide, but it could have been these people. The audience looked very much like these people, considerably older than the young people in the left part of the slide. So who you see often frames your thinking, but the reality is, what you see in your frame may not be representative of what is happening in this country as a whole. And part of what I'd like to do today is just make you aware of that the country itself is aging, even if you yourself are surrounded by people who are very young. It's important to keep that in mind because of the policies and practices that we'll be talking about. So let's turn now to talk about aging itself and think about aging for what it is. So, how we think about aging has a lot to do with our understanding of what aging is and why we age. So the question is, what exactly is aging? Is it merely the passage of time and the accumulation of days and years? Is it the progression of physiologic changes that inevitably lead to a decline in biological function, where cells die faster than they can be replaced, and that results in an inability to maintain function over time? Or is aging really a genetic phenomenon, really zeroing down on our DNA and our genes? Is it inflammation and shortening of the telomeres of our DNA, those caps on our DNA, that results in that progressive inability of organs to repair and replace cells? Or lastly, is aging a cultural construct defined by being born in a certain generation? I'm a baby boomer, somebody else is a Gen Zer or a millennial. So I would suggest to you that aging is all of those things, that in our society, the way we think about aging is influenced by all of those phenomena, and that it is, in fact, for us, a combination of all those phenomena. So the picture I just flashed up for you to look at are 6 men, all in their very early 70s. They're between 70 and 72. Some of them are maybe recognizable to you, especially Mick Jagger up there in the middle. And the point that I want to make by showing you this slide is I want you to pay attention for a minute of that man on the lower right-hand side. He actually was 72 when that picture was taken. The gentleman in the upper left was also 72 when that picture was taken. And yet you can see a very decided difference between the two of them, very decided. And the reason that I put that up there to you is I want to start to break the way we think about aging as 72 is old and feeble or frail, that there's a considerable difference in what we call phenotype, the way people look at 70. And in fact, if you were to look at 9-year-olds, line a bunch of 9-year-olds up in a school, and let's just do boys for a minute, because we'll get less variation in just a single gender identity. Let's just think about boys for a minute and think about the variation between them. Sure, there will be some size difference, but their voices will be kind of similar and their muscle mass will be similar. Now, fast forward to 72. The range of what you see in people at 72 is so much more pronounced than it is among 9-year-olds. And that has to do with a number of phenomena that we experience in our lives. And those phenomena do in part have to do with our genetic material, but they also have to do with how we've lived our lives, our behaviors, what environment we were raised in. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the biology of aging. And I want you to understand that aging is both inevitable and universal. And the only way out of aging is to die. And I don't wish that on anyone at this point. We all go through biological aging. So here we are looking at telomeres, and telomeres essentially are strands of DNA that think of telomeres as the caps on a shoelace. They're there to protect the end of the shoelace, and that's what they are in DNA as well. They're caps on that. When we talk about cellular senescence, cellular aging, what we're talking about is every time you heal a cell, or you grow, or you replace your red blood cells, or you replace your skin cells, what's happening is a cell dies, and then another cell divides to replicate. But every time a cell divides, that DNA becomes shorter, and it eventually becomes so short it no longer can divide, and therefore you begin to lose some cellular material. So telomere shortening is exactly that, and it is related to aging. But telomeres aren't just programmed by our genes. They're programmed by things like behaviors, smoking, exercise, pollution, inflammation that we're exposed to, things like COVID-19 and other diseases that we get. They're also deeply influenced by stress, and stress from communities and the type of community that we live in and the resources that are available to us. So it's not just what we inherit from our parents, but it is this host of environmental and behavioral factors that contribute to our telomere shortening and begin to give us that change or acceleration or deceleration in the aging process for us. So the aging and the acceleration and deceleration, is often known as the epigenetic clock. Now, on the right side is a strand of DNA, and on the left are the things that influence that I just talked about. Now there are neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease and things like that accelerate that are partly inherited. We're not really sure if there are environmental triggers that set them off. There may be. We also know that gender has something to do with how quickly we age. Women live longer, and men seem to have an accelerated aging pattern. We know, as I just mentioned, stress contributes to that. Basal metabolic index, or obesity, contributes to that. Infections contribute to that. On the safe side, things that act to preserve us and keep us healthy and allow us to age well are healthy foods and exercise, and frankly, healthy environments. And by healthy environments, I'm talking very granular, things like the absence of domestic violence, a peaceful home life, a loving set of parents. Those things all contribute to what is known as our epigenetic clock. So some of those are modifiable. Some of them are not independently modifiable by us. They require some impact of society to modify them for us. So let's see if I can move on to my next slide. I'm having just a time, there we go. So I want to talk about this woman who's celebrating her 100th birthday for a moment. And I want to assure you one thing. We are not focusing on stretching out life to be as long as possible. And we're not going to focus on centenarians for this session today, although I congratulate them. And I do want to share with you that there is something called the New England Centenarian Study that was begun in 1996. It's based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They currently have enrolled about 1,600 people, ages 100 and older from New England. And by studying them, they have found 281 genetic markers on 130 genes that, with some degree of accuracy, 63% of the variance in terms of predictability, they can account for make some kind of prediction about who is likely to live to be 100. But I want you to divorce yourself of one idea, and that's why I put this up here. We tend to think in our society, the older you get, the frailer you are and the sicker you are. And centenarians actually disprove that. What we really learn when we study centenarians is that the older you get, the healthier you've been. It's what leads up to that point, unless there's some cataclysmic event like a car accident or something. So one last thing, and this is why we're not talking about centenarians much today. About 1 in 5,000 Americans today live to be 100. Now, about 20 years ago, that was 1 in 10,000. So we've doubled the number of those people. But 1 in 5,000 is not a reason to go out and buy a lottery ticket to be a centenarian. It just tells you that they're increasing in number. But only 1 in 5 million people live to be 110. So what happens is there seems to be this natural longevity among humans. And beyond that, really, there's not much we can do to extend our lives. That it's not that nobody does it, but when you see 1 in 5 million living to be 110, that means the chances are infinitesimal. So our approach is not to focus on extending life forever. Some people have an interest in that. That is not my interest with you today. My approach today will be that if you're listening out there today, most of us will live well past the age of 60, well past the age of 60. And the average lifespan in the United States right now is around 78.5. It's decreasing because of COVID. But my point here is that if you just look at the people around the room with you right now, most of us will live to be past age 60. I'm already there. We're in this together. So let's discuss aging as though we were talking about ourselves, because that is who we're talking about. We're not talking about your grandmother. So often when I have conversations with people about aging, they say, oh, I went through that with my mother, or I experienced that with my grandmother. Very rarely do I hear people talk about, I'm thinking about myself. Well, what is going to happen with me? How can I have a good, healthy life? So the essential question for us is this: are we as a society ready for that pyramid to turn into a pillar, for more and more of our population to be over age 60? Right now in New Hampshire, approximately 20% of the people in the state are over age 60, or over age 65, excuse me. That number will grow, especially if the birth rate continues to decrease. Are we ready as a society to accommodate the needs of a broader volume of our population at that age? So let's talk a little bit about some current community challenges. Now, many of these are going to be discussed in far greater detail in the subsequent CDOR series, but I just want to put some of them out there for you to think about in your own life. Look at that staircase in the picture there. And I don't know if you can see it very well, but there is absolutely no barrier on the one side of the staircase. Now, that probably looked very charming to an architect at one point, but to me, it's a death trap. To me, it's a hip fracture waiting to happen, if not a neurological injury waiting to happen. And I see them on two ends of the age spectrum, both for older adults and for children. I mean, it's a senseless kind of staircase to put in, but there are lots of senseless staircases in the United States, and some of them might exist in your own home. And on the bottom part of that picture, that's just a crack in the sidewalk. Now, when you're 17 years old, a crack in the sidewalk probably isn't noticed much by you. And when you're 27, it might be a nuisance. But when you're 77, that's a risk for a hip fracture, in part because visual acuity tends to decline in after the fifth decade of life, and because our ability to navigate and our proprioception, our position sense, are interfered with. So that crack becomes an opportunity for fall. And I think we all know that falls often lead to hip fractures, and hip fractures, sadly, very often lead to a cascade of events that often leads to functional decline and death. So what do our homes and communities look like? We have busy streets, we have few sidewalks, we have exceptionally poor lighting. And here we are in northern New England, where we're just about to enter the darkest phase of our year. We require driving to get around. Our signage is poor. We have curbs that are often hard to see and abundant trip and fall hazards. Our housing is designed for the fully abled, for people who can navigate on two legs quite comfortably. Think about your own home. Could you age in that home if you lost the ability to walk? If you lost the ability to see, could you stay in that home? So we also have very complex health and social service systems. And I'm now of Medicare age, and I had to sign up for Medicare. I've been a nurse for my entire career. And I will tell you, I finally had to reach out and call the Social Security Administration for guidance on how to do it. It's extremely difficult to exact that. And for any of you who've done it, you certainly know what I'm talking about. And then finally, there's something that will be addressed in another CDOR lecture, and that is the paucity of caregivers. When you think about that pyramid that I showed you in 1960, lots of young people, so that older people could rely on somebody, maybe a daughter, maybe a son, a niece, a nephew, a paid care provider to provide support and services to them. But when we start to look more like a pillar, and when we start to get into workforce shortages, as we are certainly in right now, the ability to find a caregiver becomes a critical shortage for us. So let me just quickly review some aging issues, and then we'll start to talk about some other things. Chronic disease and healthcare become very significant issues as people age. Now, not everybody who ages is going to get hypertension or diabetes, but as we age, again, back to that genetic and that epigenetic clock, we accumulate the injuries that have been done so that the likelihood of chronic diseases becomes far more intense as we age. And by the time people are in their 70s, 5% of them will have dementia, either Alzheimer's or another type of dementia. By the time they're in their 90s, 37%. So the number grows over time. And then there's something I want to bring up to you. This is the burden of polypharmacy. I think about this a lot as a nurse. 40% of people age 70 take 5 prescription drugs per day, and 15% of them are hospitalized due to drug effects, these synergistic effects. We add drugs to deal with the side effects of other drugs. I've talked about caregiving. I want to highlight financial insecurity, because as more people come to a retirement age, they lack the resources to be able to pay their rent. Now, I don't know what the data is for New Hampshire. I recently moved back from Colorado, and I can tell you the fastest growing group of homeless people in Denver, Colorado are men and women over the age of 65, because they can no longer afford to pay their rent. The other problem that occurs, and this has been exacerbated by COVID, is fraud and abuse, and the opportunities that people have to exploit older adults, particularly when they're socially isolated. So social isolation, housing insecurity, the need for long-term services and supports, the need for technology, but some challenges in actually seeing the technology. You know, I like everybody else use a smartphone, but I have to use glasses to read my smartphone. Transportation issues and workforce issues are incredible, and the ability to access workforces, a very challenging phenomenon. So let me move. Let's see if I can get this to go to my next slide. It seems a little bit sluggish. Let's see if I can. There we go. So I'm going to talk about coronavirus and aging, because there are some particular things that we witness. Now, the jury is not completely in and ready to render an opinion here, but I want to talk to you about what happened at the time this slide was made. Now, this is data from the Centers for Disease Control. At the time, there were 125,000 deaths in the United States. We're now up to 700,000 deaths. And what we saw was persons age 65 made up only 16% of the US population, 20% of New Hampshire, 16% of the US population, but they accounted for 77% of all COVID deaths. If you drop that age down to age 50 rather than 65, people age 50 and older make up 36% of the population, but they accounted for 94% of all deaths from COVID. Now, those numbers may change a little bit, and they're changing because most older adults went ahead and got the vaccine because they saw what was happening and they wanted to be protected. Vaccine is more challenging with younger populations, and that is where we're seeing most of the infections right now. And in fact, we're seeing many deaths among younger people. Nevertheless, COVID was disproportionately deadly to older adults. But death from COVID doesn't tell the whole story, because even preliminary data show that for every 100 deaths attributed to COVID as the causative factor or a contributing factor, there were an additional 20 excess deaths in 2020. And that's based on predictive models from CDC, where they predict the death rate, and they know that there are variations from time to time. So if you eliminated COVID, there still was an additional increase in deaths, which tells you that stress, inability to access care, socioeconomic burdens played a disproportionate role for older adults during the period of COVID. And thus far, COVID-19 has reduced United States life expectancy among all racial groups by 1.31 years. If you look only at African Americans, it's reduced it by 1.9 years. And if you look only at the Latino population, it's reduced it by 3.3 years. And we haven't finished counting because we haven't finished dying from COVID. So the impact of COVID will leave a blip in our longevity and change. So now I'm gonna stop digging into the bad news and talk about some of the good news. And really finish on this. We're not really talking in this lecture about increasing lifespan and just not worrying about what happens at the end of that. There is something called the compression of morbidity. When you think about life, what we really want to do is we want to extend life, but compress the period in which people are feeling ill, in which they are incapacitated or they lose function. We want to increase their functional span, and we call that health span. So what we're aiming for is we don't just want years with no quality. We want years in which people can continue to function and function adequately and feel good about that function and continue to be participating members of society. And here I'm going to take a pause out and talk about ageism. Ageism is stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination based on age. It happens on both ends of the age spectrum. It happens to young people and it happens to older adults. For the purposes today, I'm going to talk about it relative to older adults. And frankly, here's the truth. Americans hold very negative views of aging as a time of loss, vulnerability, illness, physical and mental decline, lost value to society, incapable of dealing with technology, less capable as workers. So think about some of the things you put in when I asked, when you hear the term senior citizen, some of them were wonderful and some of them reflected the kinds of thinking that we have as Americans. So you may think, well, what's the harm in that? But I'll share with you that a wonderful researcher at Yale University by the name of Becca Levy has done an enormous amount of research on this. And what she's discovered is when people hold negative views of aging, they age poorly themselves. In fact, it's associated with physical disease as well as behavioral health disease. It's associated with depression, anxiety, diabetes, hypertension. And what she also discovered is that ageism is created at a very young age and is reinforced over time. Just if you have young children in your home, ask them the question when you hear senior citizen, what do you think? And you probably will not be surprised by what they say. So another quick piece here is that the Urban Institute did a study in 2018. They followed a cohort of 20,000 adults. They enrolled them at age 40. And what they found is that by age 50, 56% of them had been involuntarily separated from their jobs. 56% of them were either laid off or fired. And 90% of those never recovered their earnings over the subsequent 5 years. So how is ageism subtly expressed? asking for a date of graduation on an application for a job. Why do you need to know that? All you need to know is that the person's capable. The year they graduated doesn't tell you if they're capable. Assuming that older adults can't manage technology, telling jokes about dementia and aging. And I'm going to suggest even buying those birthday cards that, I've bought too. I'm not saying something to you that I haven't had to talk to myself about. Those birthday cards that ridicule aging and make people fearful of it. That subtlety injures over time. So there is a movement known as Reframing Aging, and I encourage you to go to reframingaging.org or turn to your colleagues in the UNH Center for Aging and Community Living. They've been trained in this, and they suggest many things. Many of them are the narratives and stories we tell about aging, but some of it is the language we use about aging. Instead of senior citizen, use older adult, because those are perceived by most Americans as being more positive language. And then I want to move into something else. I know that I'm going through this very quickly, but I want to talk about the cumulative impact of ageism on racism and gender discrimination. Racial and ethnic minority groups are far more likely to enter older ages in poorer health with fewer resources and greater economic vulnerabilities because of environmental issues and racism that they have endured throughout their whole lives. But racism and gender discrimination are amplified by ageism, and the consequences in terms of employment, housing, and healthcare further drive down the quality of life, their likelihood of getting a job, and frankly, it shortens their lifespan. So when we talk about the cumulative effect, we have to be exquisitely sensitive to that. And again, you're going to have a whole session on LGBTQ, but there also are unique aspects to aging in this population and a resurgence in fear of a return to discrimination that many of them felt they had left behind. They are people who are LGBTQ are twice as likely to be single as they age. That means they're less likely to have a natural caregiver, a family caregiver. They're twice as likely to live alone. They're far less likely to disclose their orientation because of fears of discrimination once again. So please attend that session. I think it will be eye-opening and will cause us all to think about how we can create a better society. So how can we craft that better world? We can improve our understanding and frankly, our discourse about aging. We can bust some myths about aging, and we can work to optimize a health span for everyone by eliminating racial, gender, sexual identity, income, and other disparities, reaching far back. What we do for 15-year-olds today will pay off in dividends in generations to come. We can create a social fabric that enhances social connections and maximizes contribution to community by building intergenerational workspaces where we have an opportunity to work with one another, understand one another better, and frankly, learn from one another. And we need to adapt our communities to allow older adults and frankly, everyone to participate fully. If you're on your town zoning board, or you participate in some way in your town government, be thinking about, can older people live in this space, or are they forced to move out there? And let's create public spaces where people of all ages can interact and contribute in a meaningful fashion so that everyone feels like they are part of the community. We are, after all, in New Hampshire, the second or third oldest state in the nation. If we can't create a model, who can create a model? And I'll end with a couple of very wonderful studies recently. The first is that researchers in the midst of COVID looked at older adults and younger adults. And this is not to say that it wasn't stressful for everyone, but in general, older adults dealt with the stresses of COVID better than younger adults did. Now, there are many reasons for that, much of which has to do with experience and wisdom and having lived through hardship before, but it also has to do with resilience. So they were better able to put the pandemic in perspective. And lastly, a wonderful study done by the University of Birmingham looked at learning and motivation. What motivates people to learn through all stages of life? And they found that younger people were most motivated to learn when the benefits of learning accrued to them personally. Whereas older adults, this is people over 65, learn faster and better when the benefits accrue to others. Now, that is not in any way an indictment of either of them, but I think it does express that as people age, the phenomenon of learning for all of us is we learn best when the learning is meaningful to us. And I once learned something when I was a young nurse, that there is a time in our life we spend the first third of our life learning, the second third of our life earning, and the third third of our life returning. This understanding that we will leave this planet at some point. How can we leave it in a better place? And one of those ways is to craft more age-inclusive communities. So I'm going to end with just a couple of slides. There are very promising developments in aging. On the right-hand side of this, I have some technologies, smart apps that detect falls and can call 911, care bots in the upper right-hand corner. I've had the privilege of seeing a bunch of care bots. I think there's still some work needs to be done on them. Driverless vehicles. These are all in development, and they may not be ready for prime time yet, but they're coming. On the left-hand side, it's really about how do we build better communities. The picture you might recognize as Beacon Hill is Beacon Hill is a village community where neighbors reach out to neighbors to help support them, provide transportation, provide guidance on home modification. And home modification for people who have acquired some functional disability is essential because most homes in the United States are built for well-abled people. And I'll end by saying a lot of people are working in the aging space. Clearly, AARP, the Centers for Disease Control, HHS, and SAGE is a group that's working on a national level in the LGBT community. On the state and local level, there is a SAGE Maine. There is not a SAGE New Hampshire for this community. But there is also an organization of LGBTQIA Aging Project in Boston. Your own colleagues at UNH in the Center for Aging and Community Living are excellent resources. And I'll end by just asking this. I started by saying we're aging, and I meant we are aging. What do you want the world to be like when you're 80? So please reimagine aging with me. And that's the end of my prepared comments. I'm more than happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Margaret, for that rich and thought-provoking presentation and for sharing your extensive knowledge on aging. Yes, I'm clapping virtually here. I'm seeing others do the same. And I think that the question that you pose, what do you want your world to be like when you are 80, is a really great segue to spending some time answering questions from the audience today, as well as sharing some reflections that we're seeing in the chat feature. So I'm going to read to you some of the questions that have come in. And earlier on in the presentation, there was a question when you were talking about the population distributions. There was a question, does the regional distribution reflect economy and health systems? And for Florida, seasonal migration.
So let me answer the second part first. It does not answer seasonal migration to Florida unless the person lists Florida as their primary residence. So Florida is an errant player, but we certainly know that seasonally it is very, has a very high population of older adults, many of whom don't claim that as their first home. But when I presented the data to you, those are people who claim Florida as their state of residence. So yes, absolutely, there's an economic indicator. And when you look at where, in particular, young people are attracted to right now, they tend to be attracted to urban centers, to lively urban centers, partly for job opportunity, partly for lifestyle issues. So the economy in that way does drive people. And clearly states like Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont lose out in that. And if they are to win, they're going to win in places like Burlington, Manchester, and Nashua, and Portland. But a large percentage of our states are exceptionally rural. I would also add, and I didn't mention this, that rural areas are far older in general than urban areas in the United States. And once again, it has to do with economy. So as businesses pull out, older adults tend to stay in a community, but young people move to find another job. So part of the challenge for states is to build economic opportunity for younger people to live there and choose to stay there as they age.
Thank you. When I look at the chat, I also see that there's quite or several reflections and comments about social isolation and loneliness. So I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about social isolation and loneliness,
Yes.
what the trends are, impacts on older adults,
Sure.
and how we might address it?
Sure, and absolutely. And I think we're going to see much more of this in the wake of COVID, because there are so many studies that are going on right now related to social isolation. But let's take COVID aside for just a moment. Social isolation is one of the most serious, most impactful issues facing older adults in the United States. And as bad as it is now, it is likely to get worse in another 20 years because of the declining birth rate. Once upon a time in the United States, we kept our families around us through our old age, but we no longer do that. We're a moving society. And as younger people, we tend to go to where the jobs are, whereas older adults tend to stay where they grew up, places where they know, and they created friends. As people age and their families move away, and perhaps their social connections, their natural supports die or move away, move to Florida, their social circle becomes smaller and smaller, and their opportunities for engaging in meaningful conversation and relationships with others begin to shrink. When COVID came, that it was almost as though it locked people into a particular place, and that was made worse if they didn't have access to broadband technology or a modality that allow them to connect to other people. And what we've seen already in COVID is an explosion of depression and anxiety that can be tied to social isolation. Even before COVID, we knew that social isolation was associated with early death, that it literally cuts off years of people's lives. And it probably does, and it also accelerates the development of dementia. Probably because we are social animals, and in order to stay healthy, we need the engagement of other people. We thrive on that engagement. There are many strategies to try and reduce social isolation, but one of the challenges, and pay attention when your speaker comes to talk about aging in place, one of the challenges of aging in place is if you're aging in place down a dirt road in Sandwich, New Hampshire, where you can't see or talk to your neighbors, that's very isolating. If you're aging in place in a vibrant neighborhood in Southern New Hampshire, then your neighbors are possibly keeping an eye on you. So where you are can be exacerbated, can exacerbate that loneliness. Now, strategies to deal with that involve the use of technologies, but technologies are good and they have proven to create a dent. The best thing is human contact. So, friendly visitors of some kind, a call a day with a human voice on it, the person who drops off Meals for Wheels actually popping in to see you and having time for a conversation. Those are essential. Bringing people together in a senior center. But I'm going to share just a beautiful model I saw in Kentucky a couple of years ago. I know they had to put it on pause during COVID, but it's a YMCA. So it's a community low income YMCA outside Louisville, Kentucky. And it's connected by a bridge to an elementary school on one side, and it's connected to a nursing home on the other side. And the YMCA had all kinds of programs that commingle older adults and kids. And they did a couple of beautiful studies demonstrating that it improved the health and well-being of the older adults. And it also improved the attention span and calmness of children in those programs. So I think there is so much more to be done. I think we had an epidemic, it's still there. We have an epidemic of loneliness in the United States. It's not just restricted to aging, but it is particularly felt in aging communities who lack the ability to go outside, or frankly, in the wake of COVID, are fearful.
Thank you. And we had lots, you spurred on with your answer, lots of further comments about social isolation, and particularly intergenerational aspects, and whether or not those are increasing. Just briefly, do you see those as increasing?
Well, they were increasing definitely before COVID, definitely. And COVID has put a pause on them. You might know that virtually every nursing home in the state of New Hampshire had kids coming in doing choral groups or play groups, and they abruptly stopped that during COVID. And they did it because children couldn't be vaccinated, and there was concern about them creating illness in older adult communities. So I think we've seen this terrible pause. It's been a terrible pause. And I personally am anxious to see those programs begin to resurrect themselves, so that we can build not only the health and wellness of older adults, but we can build a sense of shared purpose in community. Now, I do know, once again, that there are some ways of dealing with that. One of them is to get the third graders together singing and have that in real time video shown to people in senior centers and other places like that. And we also know, and there's good data on this, that if you had a grandparent, for example, or a great grandparent who really couldn't get out during COVID because it was just too dangerous for them, they carried too much comorbidity, that connecting with family members via FaceTime or Zoom really helped to improve depression and prevent anxiety and give people a better outlook on life, give them a sense that this would end and their family was still connected with them. But I'm anxious to see much more come about, and in much more realistic fashion. Just one last comment about FaceTime. The downside of a cell phone is it doesn't, I mean, it's better than nothing, but it doesn't seem like the real person talking to you. The larger the screen can become, the more it feels like the person is in the room with you. So I think we need to expand our technologies. We need to improve the digital display so that it feels like a real person to both entities.
Thank you. Are there policies that could be instituted to incentivize multi-generational housing?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, and some of them are on a very local level. Long ago, probably around the time I was in my early 20s, I developed a philosophy that schools are some of the most socially isolated places in the world, because who in heaven's name thinks that 10-year-olds learn best when surrounded by other 10-year-olds? It almost goes against our nature as humans to cohort ourselves by these strict age divisions, and yet we do that probably for reasons that have to do with efficiency and money. But one of the policies that is enacted now, and it's frankly enacted because of risks to children from shooters and other dangerous situations, is nobody's allowed into the school anymore. You have to be invited in, you have to go through some security while you're there. There are guards in the halls. If there was some way of creating a pre-screened group of older adults that had their senior center located right inside a school, that would change the policy from being schools are only for children from ages 5 to 18 or 5 to 13, and then 13 to 18, to a place that is an actual community room, and trying to push some of that together. Other places are, and anybody who knows about transportation funding knows that transportation tends to come in these very narrow bands. There's school transportation money, there's older adult transportation money. If somehow we could commingle those dollars and pay for some pilot programs to have kids and older adults share some transportation dollars. So when they need transportation, they're sharing it with somebody who's a much younger person, or we get a mix of ages, middle ages as well into that. Many big cities do that because kids take public transportation to school, but in places like New Hampshire, that almost doesn't happen. So those are the kinds of policies you could begin to peck away at. In fact, every time you look at a policy of any kind, including the ones we've been living with for the last 20 years, we should say to ourselves, does this draw generations together or does it separate them?
That's a
One
great-
last thing, and that is zoning in your town zoning. I mentioned that earlier in the presentation. I will tell you, I'm not a big fan of zoning that exclusively puts older adults in a place by themselves, because I think we know from looking at that, it may create a safe place for them, but it doesn't create a place where they understand younger people or younger people understand them. So, but look at your own town zoning. And I'm not going to tell you what town I used to live in, but there is a 3-acre minimum building requirement there. So if you want to build, you have to have 3 acres. 3 acres spaces us out, and spacing us out does not draw us together. Clustered housing developments where all generations are drawn together has been shown to be much safer, much more acceptable to people, and creates a better sense of community.
Going back to your comments about policy, I love the lens and the question that you use to evaluate policy. So shifting gears here, we have a question that is framed in terms of the conversation in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. Can you talk about how New Hampshire or New England fared in terms of accommodating older adults in congregate settings versus how did we compare to other states?
So you might know, and I'm not saying anything that wasn't very public, at the beginning of the pandemic, New Hampshire underperformed every state in the country in terms of the number of deaths that occurred in nursing homes in particular. So the nursing home is skilled care, congregate tends to have unskilled care as well as skilled care. Skilled care meaning requires the services of a registered nurse. New Hampshire underperformed every other state. It quickly, however, caught up to that. And there are some data that I would share with you where I would say New Hampshire has only a modest amount of nursing homes. And many of the people who were in nursing homes are among the frailest people we had. Excuse me, I'm gonna pull down my shade because it's right in my eyes. New Hampshire has among some of the frailest people in our population who dwell in nursing homes. That is their home. And they were in no position to easily protect themselves. I mean, if you remember back, and I worked very closely with this, if you remember back to the early guidance, nursing homes were directed to close the doors of all residents, stop all visitation, stop all outsiders from coming in, screen all staff who were coming in for any symptoms or exposure to COVID-19. All congregate meals stopped, meaning people no longer could eat in the presence of their friends. All social events stopped. Everything was dedicated to a single room. And that was in response to the number of deaths that occurred in nursing homes in New Hampshire. Those were occurring in other states as well. New Hampshire has a set of very old buildings, and it's difficult because of the structure of buildings to isolate people or to keep people safe without isolating them. And then, consider where the people who are essential workers are coming from. They often are paid low wages. They often come from places where they share housing with many other people who were also essential workers, so their opportunities for exposure were greater. So it was a perfect storm of bad events that placed people in congregate settings at particular risk for COVID-19. So New Hampshire started out in a very bad place, and it quickly righted the ship. And it did so by doing some very severe measures, which I think on the other end, on the social isolation end, were very, very challenging for families, individuals who lived in nursing homes, and frankly, for the staff who serviced them, the isolation was terrible. As vaccine came on board and cases in communities dropped, New Hampshire did extremely well performing. And I would say that vaccine uptake among congregate centers in New Hampshire is better than most places. Frankly, we sit right next to Vermont. Vermont outperformed everybody on many of these measures. And I think the reasons are a little unclear to us why they did so well. It may have been how quickly they acted. It may have been some of the nature of their nursing homes, but they were the state to follow. New Hampshire then, along with Maine, righted the ship and has done a very good job in protecting people. That is not to say that there's 100% protection, because staff come and go from congregate care centers. Last comment about that, many congregate communities that were not nursing homes limited who could come into those nursing homes. And so they were able to create a bubble, kind of a safety bubble. And they were also able to give some staff an ability to stay there and live in that place. And as soon as testing became available, everybody used it and screened cases out very quickly. So we didn't start out in a good place, but we finished in a good place. Well, it's not over yet, but we're in a much better place. And we came quickly to that place.
So just briefly, we're hearing that there's most certainly many lessons learned, in particular in congregate settings during the time of particularly in the beginning of the pandemic. Are we seeing any changes in response to those lessons learned?
Sure, absolutely you are. And one of them that I'm just delighted about is, I think one of the things we've learned is we didn't need to shut down the whole facility when there were a couple of cases in a facility. That if we could cluster those cases together and assign dedicated staff to them and open the rest of the facility to other people, still using screening, of course, still using testing, of course, that we could preserve as normal a life as possible for everyone who was unaffected in those facilities. So though that has been relaxed, I also think that facilities have done a better job at keeping families informed about what's happening in the facility and why they're enacting the regulations that they are enacting, and providing opportunities to engage with a family member. You might remember at the very beginning, even if unless people were actively dying, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid declared that no family member could come to pay a visit in that room. And that was heart-wrenching to people who lived in the facilities, to their family members, and to the staff who worked there. That has since been relaxed by CMS, and CMS now considers, in their languages, hardship or essential need. So it could be somebody who's just very lonely and needs a family member to be there. And there are restrictions still. If the person's vaccinated, they can relax those restrictions. If they're unvaccinated, they still maintain masking. But we've allowed touch, we've allowed visitation. I think the bigger issues are, how do we configure our spaces? So, the logo that I have up there reminds me of the Eden Alternative. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Eden Alternative, but it is a new design for long-term care facilities that require skilled care, that are far more home-like and much less like a hospital, that cluster people in they call them communities, and they cluster people in those small communities, and there are green spaces and pets are allowed in, and it feels they have common kitchen space where they can exercise make a light meal for themselves if they want to, instead of being treated like a patient in a healthcare facility. So we're starting to see more movement toward that. Frankly, a lot of that will take the regulators to release some regulations to allow that to happen. And it is, I'm sorry to say, it's an expensive model, but it's if we could magically transform facilities to the Eden alternative model, residents of the facilities would be far happier. It would feel much more like a home, and families would be much happier. And I think we would see greater longevity and high function in those facilities, because people would see it as a place to live and live happily.
I have one final, I think we have time for one final question. With so many areas of concern, where do we even begin to create that world? To go back to your question, to create the world that we all want when we're 80.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So this is going to be Margaret Frankhauser's answer, and others who are experts in aging might give you a different answer. But a place I think you can begin, because it's very simple, is to look at reframing aging and think about how we think and talk about aging in the United States, and modify your own thinking and your own language. And I happen to know Jennifer is a trained trainer, and I'm a trained trainer, and she can help you with that. The reason I think that's so important is, as long as we engage in a discourse of aging that casts people as frail and incapable and lacking agency, we will continue to make decisions that segment them. When we start to frame aging in a way that we think of ourselves as aging, then we open up to new ideas. So that is a place to start. And then a second step, I would say, is in whatever sphere you work in. Maybe it's public policy, maybe it's education, maybe it's healthcare. Ask yourself, when a new idea is floated, or a new regulation is proposed, or somebody says, can we try it this way? Ask yourself, does this have a disproportionate impact on older adults, a disproportionate negative impact on older adults? Use that lens, because you will be, if you are not now, you will be that older adult someday. And by the time you are there, if you use those lenses, the world will be a better place. It will be a better place to age.
Thank you. And just, I want to thank you once again, Margaret, for sharing your rich expertise on aging and for helping us kick off the Sador series today. I am going to transition us now, and I'm going to transition to a colleague within the university, Casey Golomsky, who's going to summarize and bring the meeting to a close.
Thank you so much for that transition, Jennifer, and for this wonderful presentation, Margaret. I very much appreciate the different experiences and roles that you bring to the information that you presented to us. I can tell this is something that's you're passionate about, and that you bring almost kind of like a bedside ethos or manner to the delivery of the material. You're not coming to this as a strict policy maker or, population modeler, even though we start out with the pyramid to pillar. You bring it in a very sensitive, humanistic approach to the material that we will all eventually see ourselves in. And speaking of seeing ourselves and visualizing what society could look like, what we can look like vis-a-vis society, in terms of visualization, I want to circle back to our other core actor in this session, which is our artist and project director, Kate Crary, to illustrate and show us a bit of what she's accomplished for us based on your collective input. So Kate, can you please review some of what you've captured and drafted for us, please?
Thanks so much, Casey. Hi, everybody. So a lot of themes were captured in this artwork today, and I'm going to kind of walk through and walk along, and then we'll get a nice big pan of everything. But we really focused in on, that pyramid to pillar model, understanding kind of and asking ourselves, what does it mean to age? What does a senior citizen mean? What is aging? It's not just a number, and we talked about telomeres and some biology there, and the epigenetic clock. We also talked about ageism and how it starts early. It kind of impacts our children moving forward, and actually results in poor aging as we age. And we talked about the older you get, the healthier you've been, and how that actually equates to a health span. And then as we move forward, we captured some of the list of aging issues, which can feel really, really long. It's a long list right here. But it leads to opportunity, and then we moved into those opportunities. So we have reframingaging.org. And then over here, we have kind of what's next for us, right? Because we are all aging. And here's where we captured, a lot of those takeaways, as well as that great model that Margaret brought up about the YMCA being connected to a nursing facility and an elementary school. So we kind of captured all that here. Now I'm going to get out of the way so we can see the larger work. You, Casey, thank you.
It's absolutely beautiful. And Kate will be joining us for each session in the series with the goal of creating what will kind of become a giant mural that reflects our conversations taking place across the years. You've really provided us, I think, with a beautiful landscape here. And, landscape, I think, speaks to one of the major themes that came up in Margaret's presentation, that of geography, population vis-a-vis geography, the geographies of infrastructure and the places that we make in which we live and try to inhabit, and how we need to build it better. We need to engage in almost like an overhaul of the world that we live in, make it more sustainable, not only in kind of an environmental aspect, but a sociologic one too. Because I think another of the major themes that you pointed out was that aging is an embodied process. We sponge up or internalize the life course events, the social interactions, the aspects of our physical environment across the life course, and embodiment, ranging from things like the telomeres to embodied aspects like feasting at a barbecue in the neighborhood with friends and family, whether you have those neighbors around in your apartment complex or your cul-de-sac, to embodying the movement across a sidewalk, watching out for those cracks and where we can kind of metaphorically repair them. And meeting face to face, I think engaging aging in a humanistic perspective, which I appreciate the graphic illustration really brings in a medical humanities perspective to all of this, rather than just a strict kind of medicine from a biophysical sense. That we are being sponsored by the Center for the Humanities, one of our main hosts for this series, in which we're very grateful. And the humanistic approach is also a relational one, and that Margaret really asks us to think about how we see ourselves in the other, and looking at the other initially, as you've all kind of given us with the comments from the initial prompt, was that the other in terms of an aged person is, I remember the comments there, it was silver hair, wrinkles, glasses. The longer that we're beckoned to look at that image, the more transparent it becomes, in that we're actually looking into a mirror, looking at ourselves, dispossessing ourselves of that archetype, right? And I appreciate that you said this is a very kind of, Western kind of, cultural priming in terms of this image. I'm an anthropologist. I'm always interested in kind of a cross-cultural perspective. And we are in the US very much defined by a successful aging model, that you can run that marathon if you just really try, and you can, just invest, talk to Susie Orman, you're going to get all your investments done with your individual choices and things like that. And we don't have a lot of great cultural models in our society that enable us to age with dignity, or to age and be okay with frailty, to be okay with assisted dying. We're afraid of these things because of the cultural priming that we inhabit in this country. So these are some of the bigger themes that I was able to constellate from the material presented. And again, I really appreciate you kicking off the series for us in such an effective and wide-ranging way that shows us the landscape of what it means to age in America. And again, I thank all my team members for this too. And that landscape, I think, as Kate visualized and you spoke about, again, sets us up very nicely for the several sessions that we have coming forth. And if I can ask one of my colleagues to put up the slide for the next session, I think that would be helpful, as you can get a teaser of what we're going to be seeing. Next month, November, is National Caregivers Month in the United States. And so we are doing a specific session on caregiving with the subtitle of Honor or Burden, the Contributions of Caregiving and Their Impact. And we feature a range on this panel of participants from the local Dwight and Gail Davis, who are owners of a caregiving nonprofit named Senior Helpers, Pat Yosha, who is actively involved with the older adult community, a caregiver, a teacher. And we're also featuring Bob Stevens, who is the Vice President of Caregiving Programs for AARP in Washington, DC. And this will really nicely integrate local and national perspectives, again, bringing us face to face with how we can implement policy in our own communities and family systems. And from there, we'll move through the rest of the year to other sessions that focus on racial minority, aging, intergenerational design. How do we actually do this geographic overhaul in the communities that we live in? We'll have another humanistic topic, a Phi Beta Kappa lecture by the Professor Rosemarie Thompson Garland, one of the key literary figures about disability in America, and the session on LGBTQ aging. I want to thank everybody for participating and being with us today. And I want you all to also look out in your inboxes in your email, as you'll be getting a message from us at SADOR and UNH that will invite you to first evaluate the session that you just participated in, tell us what you learned, share with us things that maybe you didn't share in the chat, help us understand how we can do better going forward. And there, in that email, there will also be a link to the November session on caregiving, which we invite you all to participate in. So, and the next session will also be on Zoom. And with that, I bid you all a good afternoon, and thank you for attending the SADOR series. And thank you again, Margaret and Kate. Thank you.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. Good night, everyone. And thank you for joining for this important session.
Awesome.